Professor Al Fadl, just picking up on the points you were making there. I've been sitting here asking myself, okay, you've got a large number of Americans, Muslim Arab Americans, who are deeply alienated from the system. And so I ask myself, what do you have to do to break down this enmity and hostility between American intelligence and American law enforcement and that significant community in America? And maybe one answer, I want your answer, but maybe one answer would be that you've got to have some kind of a predictable and orderly process that deals with these tough cases that we've been talking about here. And what strikes me is that we don't have it. The Congress has not given us a framework to deal with this new phenomenon of terrorism. And so far as I can see, the executive branch is not either. And so you get these results of people being held for very extended periods of time without counsel, without incommunicado, with some suggestions at least that they've been physically abused. Some suggestion, I don't know if this is true or not, that we've deported some of them to countries that commit torture. And it just seems to me that you have a lack of a framework, a lack of a system. I don't know where this phrase enemy combatant came from. I mean, all of a sudden it's become, it's blossomed. Well, I've raised a number of things, but I guess the key question is, what do we do about this relationship with all of these people that are alienated now?
Well, I want to emphasize and actually try to...
And I'd like the others to comment on my general observations as well.
I try to make this point in the report as well. I don't think we've reached a point in which we can say that the American Muslim community overall is alienated. The American Muslim community played a very large part in the last elections and was, I think, played a key role in getting President Bush elected. And we are really talking about trends and orientations. I don't think we have yet gotten to the point where we can say the American Muslim is alienated or feels completely alienated or feels like an insular minority or an oppressed minority or something like that. I think the American Muslim...
Is it okay for the American government to do nothing?
No, that is actually the part where I completely... in fact, not only the existence of a framework, which I completely agree with you about, not only the existence of a framework, but I think that it would do not just the American people, but even would do the American Muslim community and the Arab American community great good if we are extremely serious about the enforcement of something like our immigration laws. I don't think the state of confusion where we have laws that we enforce at times and not enforce at other times does not actually help this community figure out the rules of the game, and so that they can know what do they have to do to stay safe, and what do they have to, and what type of conduct will get them into trouble.
Have we overemphasized the immigration system as a counterterrorism measure?
I think we tend to emphasize it conceptually, but we are woefully lacking in applying our immigration system as we actually talk about it. I mean,
Most of the people that have been detained under the immigration law, have they not?
Yeah, except for those detained as material witnesses, they're American citizens and outside the purview of the immigration law.
Professor Ting and Professor Martin, I'd like you to comment on this question of a framework and any other thoughts you have about the things that Professor El Fadl and I have been talking about.
Well, I'm gratified to hear Professor El Fadl say that the American Muslim community is not, in fact, alienated. My hometown is Dearborn, Michigan, which has the largest Arab American community in the United States. Certainly my impression that people are not alienated. I have to say that, in my view, the success of the American experiment speaks for itself. That there are always going to be foreign enemies of freedom who are going to pick away and criticize the way in which we do things, this or that. That's always going to be the case, and there's, frankly, not a whole lot we can do about it. If we fix this, they'll criticize something else. I don't think, we need to tell the world that we're perfect in every regard. We're not perfect. We are, after all, a republic founded on slavery. So we've got plenty of bad experiences in our history to learn from.
Are you not worried about the fact that the power of government can hold someone indefinitely until the end of hostilities?
I'm not
that
worried,
they do not have
Commissioner,
access to counsel and that they're held incommunicado. Doesn't that bother you?
I'm not worried because the system of checks and balances established in our Constitution will come into play. We will have considered judgment on that very issue. And, I concede it's a difficult issue, but that's why we created a court system, to hear these difficult issues. Mr. Padilla will get a day in court. His case will be heard, and wise jurists in accordance with the Constitution will tell us what they think ought to be done in this situation. So
the system will eventually work.
Yeah, the system of checks and balances, the two-party system, is all in play here, I think. And so I have confidence in the system. I have confidence in the Constitution. These issues are going to be raised in due course.
Mr. Walker, Professor Walker?
Yes, I fully agree with the need for a clearer framework, both in this area of applying the laws of war to an anti-terrorist struggle, and in the realm of immigration law. That's really what I was trying to address in my comments. We would be in a lot better position now. I would be less concerned about the occasional use of these kinds of detention powers for, quote, enemy combatants, if the executive branch had made an effort to try to spell out an overall framework for when that power is authorized, what are the limits, what are the checks, where do they apply. We really haven't had that. We've had instead pretty much all-out defense of complete authority in the executive branch. I don't minimize the difficulties in working that out and modifying rules from other situations.
The Congress has not done it either.
Congress has not done it either. No, I mean, yes, it would be good for Congress to do it. It probably would have been best for the executive branch to make a proposal and put it in the form of a proposed bill. In the immigration area, it is one of the bases for seeing some of the uses of immigration powers after September 11th as illegitimate was that they are powers that are not very widely used, not resolutely used in other sorts of settings. It's not that they were illegitimate in themselves, but there seemed to be a sort of picking and choosing in that way. I detect a real agreement here among all three members of the panel on how we would be better off as a society if we were more thorough in applying immigration controls generally, more resolutely, and beefing up enforcement of all kinds, not necessarily for its immediate impact on the war against terrorism, because that would be a better scenario. That's probably not totally characteristic of people who teach immigration law in law schools today. But I think that is very important, and then we would be in a position to feel that the occasional use here was justified. I would say one other thing. I think it's a mistake to look to immigration powers themselves, though, as a major part of the war against terrorism. They can be employed, but usually when information has been developed through other means, better intelligence in particular, then among the things you may do with regard to someone who is identified as a terrorist may be to use immigration authorities.
Let me ask you another question. I'm working now in a Institute of Advanced Research. And one of the things we do is bring scholars in from all over the world, quite a large number of them in the course of a year, not unlike really what a lot of universities do. We've been having a lot of trouble with visas, getting certain people here. We hear the stories about scholars who want to come here, not just scholars, but maybe highly trained professionals who want to come here for additional training, having difficulty get into the country. We hear stories now about scholars from particularly in the Middle Eastern countries who prefer to go to London or some other country for their education. And all I have at this point is kind of anecdotal evidence. I don't know really what's happening. And I know that our government is concerned about it, but I just wanted to kind of get the sense that you folks have. Are we in this situation denying ourselves access to these highly qualified individuals in a variety of fields? Is it something that we need to be worried about, or is it not? Will, as Professor Ting says, the system correct itself without us doing anything? Is it a problem?
Well, I believe it is a problem. It's not an insurmountable problem. I think there are correctives that are in the works, and I'm not totally pessimistic in the long run, but we need to keep that kind of risk in mind as we design additional safeguards to apply in the immigration screening system. A lot of new systems were employed after September 11th. Some of them have gotten off to kind of a rocky start. They take a long time. There's understandable confusion about exactly how they operate, and I think that's been the source of at least some of the discouragement that people have felt. Now, we could get to a tipping point and people will start looking in much larger numbers to other countries as the place where they want to go. So we need to be mindful of that. But there have been some improvements in those systems. If they can be worked more into a kind of smooth routine of immigration processing, it won't be such a big issue. But we really should think about that. Some efforts, well, in this whole realm, it's a matter of trade-off. We still have very strong interests as a nation in facilitating immigration. Students, tourists, scholars, for business purposes, and to the extent that we expand screening mechanisms, we will discourage some of that. We needed to, and we have improved it to some extent, but we need to keep very much in mind that kind of trade-off.
I fully concur in what David has just said. I will only add that what was clearly unacceptable was the situation that we had before 9/11, where we had students coming into the United States and we had no clue whether they were in fact enrolling as students. We had no clue whether they were dropping out and doing other things. We didn't know whether they were in fact taking courses or not. And I think
things like pilot training.
Pardon?
In things like
pilot training. So I think it's the steps that Congress has repeatedly directed be implemented are in the right direction.
Well, my experience, at least direct experience, has been the most troubling thing is that part about inconsistency, and I think the key word is confusion. Recently, for instance, there have been several individuals in their 50s or in their 60s, typically university professors, have traveled, delivered papers in England and in all over Europe, recognized specialists in one field or another. And then it comes as a real surprise. And some of them, in fact, several of them had already come to the United States several times for conferences and so on. And then they're denied a visa. In my experience is that this inconsistency in practice and the inability to sort of say, well, this criteria, I can rely on these criteria or I cannot rely on these criteria, is still very much not just an earmark of the system, but it's become much more so after 9/11. And I don't have the same trust as Professor Ting does in the system. I don't think the system corrects itself. I think it's invariably human beings who create the system, who correct the system, who constitute the system. And I just want to say that quite often, if you think about cases like the Chinese exclusion cases or the Japanese internment cases or even the more recent cases, the cost that we pay is extremely high before we can claim a correction. And that's fine for the people who are not directly involved in paying the cost. But it's a mind frame that I am extremely uncomfortable with when we are willing to sacrifice as long as it's on someone else's dime.
Do you believe we're profiling Muslims now?
Well, in what context? I mean,
In immigration and granting visas?
most certainly, most certainly we have applied a different set of criteria and standards to the admission of Muslims and to the consideration of visa applications for Muslims. All you have to do is go to the American embassy in any Muslim country, and you'd feel this. One of the things that had struck me, I was speaking to I asked the American ambassador in Egypt about this, and he confirmed that visa applications to the United States from a country like Egypt saw a sharp drop, but it's a sharp drop from the wrong type of people, the people that we would actually want to encourage to come to the United States because of their accomplishment, of their achievements, of so on and so forth. And the perception is there's no point in applying because they don't want Muslims. And I don't think it's a completely unjustified perception. I think we need to set our criteria very clearly, our immigration laws very clearly, and we need to send a message to the world that we are dead serious about applying both our criteria that say welcome and our criteria that say we don't want you in this country.